Well, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google, they're all facing the threat of antitrust probes by the federal government. Yahoo Finance's JP Mangdolinden is live in San Francisco with a wrap on what we're looking at with all these probes.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So perhaps most notably earlier this week, reports emerged that the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission had officially agreed to divvy up their duties in terms of investigating these tech companies. The FTC had agreed to tackle Amazon, and the Justice Department had agreed to tackle Google. Now, of all the big tech companies that will face increased scrutiny, which also include, of course, Facebook and Apple, Google perhaps might have the most to worry about, having spoken to several legal experts earlier this week. And that's largely because Google has come up against lawmakers perhaps the most over the last several years. It paid a the European Commission fined Google $1.7 billion for abusive online ad practices earlier this year. Last year, the EU's executive arm fined Google another $5 billion. And then several years ago, ending in 2013, I believe, the FTC concluded a 2-year investigation into Google about its anti-competitive practices. Now, the FTC back then ultimately decided that Google had not violated anti-competitive practices. But internally, there apparently was a lot of, I don't want to say turmoil, but there were some disagreements about that. One bureau ultimately inside the FTC basically argued that Google had, in fact, violated anti-competitive practices, while another bureau inside the FTC argued otherwise. Now, it's unclear, fast forward several years, it's unclear how the Justice Department will approach its investigation, whether or not it will be privy to some of that information from the FTC, from that investigation that was closed several years ago. But needless to say, if any of these tech companies have something to worry about, it's certainly Google.
All right. Well, thank you, JP. Let's stick with Google, because one of the other areas in which it's coming under criticism is about what gets posted on YouTube. And YouTube is taking some steps to remove hate speech or false reports from its site. Sinan, I'm curious on your take on whether YouTube is doing enough in this area.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a big difference between taking down speech and demonetizing it so that they can't earn ad revenue. And what we're seeing is that there's a fine line between speech that they actually take down and speech that they demonetize. And I feel like it is a mistake, as horrible as a lot of the things and derogatory speech that is shown on YouTube and on social media more generally. I think it is a very, very tricky subject for these platforms to regulate free speech. I do think, for instance, that policies should be set up that, for instance, take down live streams of terrorist attacks or violence or child pornography, but that those lines should be bright lines. There are lots of other remedies, for instance, defamation lawsuits when there are personal attacks against an individual.
But what if they were regulated, say, like broadcast was regulated or like print was regulated? Because the kinds of things that appear on YouTube, I don't think legally, in some cases, could appear on FCC-regulated channels, for example, right?
I think that until there is an extension of the regulatory framework to these social platforms,
should there be?
I think their proactive regulation of free speech is a mistake on their part.
Okay.
Now, how the answer to your question, should there be, is that the devil's in the details.
Right.
Exactly how that regulation should apply to platforms, it has to be different than broadcasters, because they face a free-for-all of trillions of pieces of content per day all over the world. And regulating that kind of speech is much more difficult for them than it is potentially for a broadcaster that has tighter control. So while there might be a reason to extend regulatory frameworks and sort of broadcaster type roles to social media, it has to be the devil's in the details. It has to be specific to those platforms.